they issued me with a document where they said, if my stress levels are 1 to 3, I will do this, you should do this. If my stress levels are 4 to 6, I will say this, you should do this. If like I was like a robot.
Wow.
Like an algorithm for a computer.
Oh my gosh.
That was, and at that point I was like, okay, I can't take this anymore. I just got to quit.
Hi, I'm Sharon Landon and welcome back to Old Asian Lady. Today my guest is Fraser Stewart. Fraser, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
Sure, so can we start off a little bit about, just briefly talking about your background?
Yeah, so I'm from Scotland in the UK originally. I have a PhD in mathematics. And before I came to Taiwan, I was a patent examiner at the UK IPO for 8 years. And I've been living in Taiwan for about 3.5 years. And for the first 3 years, I was an English teacher. And then recently, I've just decided to start my own patent consultancy firm in Taiwan.
Okay. Oh, interesting. When people first meet you, what do you feel like they maybe misunderstand about you?
So in Taiwan, the most common one is that that I can't speak Chinese.
Right.
That's the biggest one I get in Taiwan.
Okay. And that's actually normal because most foreigners do not speak Mandarin.
I think they should at least try to speak to me in Chinese first, but they don't. They just go straight to English, and that's very annoying. I find that really frustrating.
Well, how about like on the opposite end for me? They see my Asian face and they automatically assume that, you know, I speak Taiwanese or I speak a really, really fluent Mandarin, and so they'll go out. Or even if I'm with a group of friends who are foreigners, they look at me and they automatically would talk to me, even like if you're sitting next to me and you can speak Mandarin, you know.
Yeah, so I actually had a friend who was American and Taiwanese dual nationality, and he was born in Taiwan, but he grew up in America. And it was when I went out with him that would happen. They'd look at him, and talk to him, and I used to tell them, but he's a foreigner, you know. And
yeah, it's all in the perception, right?
Yeah, so that's that. In Taiwan, that's the biggest one.
Yeah.
In the UK, I don't know. It's difficult to say. Probably I come across a little bit odd, because I'm not very good at eye contact, making eye contact with people. So I think people might think I'm a little bit strange,
shy or reserved, maybe.
Yeah, a little bit odd, maybe. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That sort of thing. But I don't really know because I never really asked people. But yeah, maybe something like that. Yeah.
If you could describe yourself, I mean, outside of your CV kind of stuff, and your work experience, well, how would you describe yourself?
I'm very laid back, but I also get quite obsessed with things. Sort of, I have sort of things that I'm very, very interested in, and I'm also I'm someone that loves a routine. Like I love doing the same things at the same time every day. So I have like the time I get out of bed, time I start work, what I have for breakfast, what I have for lunch. That's, you know, it's all very sort of, everything has to be the same every day.
Structured, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, very structured. Okay.
Yeah. So that's probably a big part of my sort of daily life, if you like, following my routine.
Yeah, because that kind of was leading me to asking you about, because you have a PhD in mathematics.
I do, yeah.
And then you also studied patent law or something. And those are kind of very structured. Is that why you're attracted to?
Yeah, I did like patent examining a lot because it's a bit of problem solving as well mixed in with it, and I quite like the law. Like I'm interested in the law and sort of the legal kind of side of it as well as the technology. like I used to find it really interesting to sort of read a case and try to understand what the invention was, and then analyze the kind of legal problems with it. You know, that was always very sort of satisfying to me when you get a really hard case and you spend a bit of time on it and you think, okay, now I've got it, and then you figured it out, you know.
Yeah. So you said you started a patent company.
Okay, yes, a consultancy firm.
A consultancy. I mean, you're talking about doing it in Chinese language, or you're talking about English in certain countries that are involved?
So the aim of it was to help Taiwanese small to medium enterprises in Taiwan to get foreign patents. So Taiwan actually is quite a large patent filing country. So to give you some statistics, so the UK has a population of approximately 65 to 70 million people, and the UK IPO gets approximately 20,000 patent applications per year. Taiwan has a population of about 25 million people, or 23, 24 million. And the Taiwanese patent office gets about 75,000 patent applications per year. And the USPTO in America receives approximately 20,000 patent applications from Taiwanese companies every year as well. So there's like a very large demand for patents in Taiwan. But patents are also very expensive to get. Like, you go to big patent attorney firms, qualified patent attorneys, and they'll charge you like a fortune. And that can often be prohibitively expensive if you're a small company to do that. So I was sort of trying to bridge the gap by doing it, giving them a more affordable route to getting international patents or American patents, because obviously English is my first language. So I am in a better position to write the draft patent applications in English that are ready to be filed in the US. And I can do it for a more cost-effective price. That was the idea. Yeah.
Oh, okay. You're translating the Chinese. Its application for the Taiwanese companies are in Chinese, and you have to translate it in English, or how does that work?
It depends. Like, so if it's like a new invention, they might not have a patent drafted anyway. They just sort of tell you the information. Like, this is my invention, this is how it works, and then I would just draft it based on that, like from scratch. And they might give that to me in Chinese or in English. It's up to them, but I can. It doesn't matter because I can read both. Or they could already have a patent with the Taiwanese patent office, because you have a year from filing. If you file, say, in Taiwan, you've got 1 year to file in other countries, and that's like an international thing. They give you a year to file somewhere else. It just depends what the company wants. If they have an idea or an invention or something they're doing, then I will just do it from scratch. So they just tell me. So I just ask them, what's your invention and how does it work? And I need all the details, obviously, of how it actually works, so I can write the patent application.
Oh, okay.
You know, and I'll just do it from scratch in English. I don't write patent applications in Chinese because my Chinese isn't at that level. Like, it's good, but to write draft a patent application in Chinese requires a very
high level. Yeah. Okay, well, we'll come back to your language a little bit later. But so you being in the UK, and I think you studied also in Canada, is that right?
I did, yes.
What made you leave that and come to Asia?
So I was diagnosed with autism when I was 12. And when I was working in the UK, I disclosed that I had autism because under UK law, we have something called the Equality Act of 2010, which says that companies are required to make reasonable adjustments for people with disabilities. And so naturally I told the UK IPO about my autism so they could make reasonable adjustments, but then things just got more and more difficult for me because of my communication skills, and interpersonal skills aren't very good because of my autism. And I was getting bullied at work, and they were just making things more and more difficult for me. Basically, they were just trying to push me out without pushing me out, without explicitly firing me altogether. They were just trying to force me out.
You said you were being bullied and things, and it wasn't maybe obvious, or maybe it was obvious to you? Like what types of things? Because I'm not sure about how the UK is in terms of disability acts and disability equality, because US is a little bit more, they have a lot to do with that, even though they're not the perfect specimen either. But
So in the UK we have the law, the Disability Discrimination
Yes.
Act 2010. But if you actually want to take an employer to court, it's also cost prohibitive. Like it would cost, in Taiwanese dollars, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 400,000 Taiwan dollars, roughly, to sue your employer, and there's no guarantee you win. Like I think somewhere in the neighborhood of only like 5% of cases are actually successful. But in terms of what they were actually doing to me specifically, it starts off with kind of small stuff, and then it sort of gradually sort of builds up. So there was a woman I worked with who was called Sophie, who went off work for like 3 months or something like that. And when she came back, I saw her and said, "Oh, hi Sophie, how are you doing? Is everything okay? Da 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 da." And apparently that really offended her, just me asking her that. Later I got told by my boss, "Okay, you're not allowed to talk to her. You're not allowed to go anywhere near her. You can't even walk down the same corridor she works on."
wow.
And I said, "But I just said, hi, how are you? Like, what's the big deal?" And it's
Maybe
like,
she was thinking you were trying to pry on why she was gone for 3 months or something, maybe.
yeah, but it's just such an extreme
Right.
response. And then it later turned out that a friend of mine said to her that I think she needs autism training, which I hadn't said at all. And they blamed that on me. So it was. So it starts off with, it was just stuff like that, and then it got worse and worse. And then they issued me with a formal written warning for, again, something that wasn't even my fault, if you know what I mean. So there was a lot of things like people were basically people were provoking me or doing things to me that were very upsetting, and then they'd punish me for getting upset,
And they did this to you because they knew you had autism.
Correct.
And that was okay.
So the natural reaction was, "Oh, but he didn't." It's the usual excuses. "Oh, but they didn't mean it that way," or "They didn't," or they were just trying to do this, or "They were just trying to say it this way," or it's like gaslighting me and saying that my perception of it was somehow wrong, that sort of thing. Basically, the other person's perception was always correct. Mine was always wrong. And it just got worse and worse. And then eventually they issued me with a document where they said, if my stress levels are 1 to 3, I will do this, you should do this. If my stress levels are 4 to 6, I will say this, you should do this. If like I was like a robot.
Wow.
Like an algorithm for a computer.
Oh my gosh.
That was, and that point I was like, okay, I can't take this anymore. I just got to quit.
So then you ended up in China, in Xi'an, actually.
No, that was before the IPO. The IPO was after that.
Oh, okay. Oh.
So Xi'an was 2012 to 2013. The IPO was 2014 to 2022.
Okay, so how was your time in working in Xi'an? Because I have to tell you, when I saw that on your CV, I was like, oh, because I actually worked in Xi'an for about 5 months for a project for one of the hotels.
It was okay, but it was still China, and because it's a bit more third world, Xi'an is not as developed, say, as Shanghai, so it was kind of, the streets were a bit dirty, and obviously there's issues with things like hygiene, and it's very busy, because it's China, and I think the other thing is like the lack of freedoms and stuff, because China is communist, and there's and people say, oh, but you don't really notice it, and it's like, well, you kind of do, because you can't go on YouTube, you can't use Facebook, you have to use a VPN for everything.
Yeah.
And
the big Chinese firewall.
Yeah, and there's also just the kind of general way people generally behave in society. So people spit in the street all the time, or you see children peeing and pooping in the street. I saw that quite regularly, and people pushing in front of you in the queue. Just sort of the general, that kind of general stuff. So I was kind of happy to go back to the UK at the end of it, because people often ask me this in Taiwan. Like when they say, "Why'd you come to Taiwan?" and I usually say, "Well, I speak Chinese and I wanted to live in a Chinese-speaking country, and they'll say, well, why didn't you pick China? And it's like, well, you can't really settle down in China. You know, like it's not possible to get permanent residency in China, just for example. You can't buy property in China. You can't really have like a long-term career or, you know, like an actual life, you know, in China. But you can in Taiwan. You can build those things for yourself in Taiwan. You can have a career. You can get an APRC. You can buy property eventually, or a house, you know, apartment, whatever. And you can sort of build a life for yourself here. But that's just not really possible in China. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it depends, because I lived in Shanghai for quite a long time, and I know a lot of foreigners that lived there and had a career there. Many of them lived there for 10, 15 years, corporations and things like that. But lately, in the last few years, China has done a much more of a crackdown on foreigners that do work. I believe they have like a business visa to go there, and they have to be backed by quite large corporations.
So yes, you could live in China for many years, but there comes a point where you're basically kicked out.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not really the same thing. But if like I get an APRC, so I'm going to be applying for an APRC this year, and when I get it, you know, that's it. I can stay here for the rest of my life, and no one's going to suddenly cancel that. You know.
To get an APRC, just for people that don't know, you have to have a certain amount of salary base, and you also have to be here in Taiwan for a certain amount of years, right?
Correct, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so you decided to leave China, but what was the biggest thing did you feel like you learned or changed anyway from having lived in China for the time that you were there?
Kind of just learned that China isn't really the place for me. Put it that way, you know. I sort of realized that. I mean, I think if I was gonna, I always tell people, you know, China's nice to visit. It's nice for a holiday, but it's not really nice to live. And if I was gonna go back to China for a visit, it would be somewhere historical, like Shanghai, a very historical city. You got lots of nice things to visit, like the Bund, the French concession. These kind of places. So that would be what if I was going back to China, it would be for a holiday. That's where I would choose to go, but I wouldn't choose to live there longer term. And I think the other thing I learned is that, like, I remember when I started learning Chinese, I was studying simplified Chinese characters. And I used to think, traditional characters are useless because they're only used in Taiwan and Hong Kong, Macau. So only a small number of people use them, but obviously you've got well over 1 billion people who do simplified. First time I was in Taiwan back in 2010. And I learned traditional characters. I got like a new appreciation for them. So when I went back to China in 2012, I sort of realized that I prefer the traditional writing system to the simplified writing system.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I started studying Mandarin as well, I learned the simplified. And of course, I lived in China. I did several projects in China, and then I was based in Shanghai for over 7 years. So I was reading and seeing Simplified. So when I came to Taiwan, it was, you know, just another challenge. And I find that a lot of the simplified characters, it's like totally different than the character that you have in a traditional one. Some of them have maybe part of the radical or part of it, so you kind of easily guess that it's this complicated character. But some of it is totally different, so it's been interesting and challenging in that way on how they created the Chinese simplified character, you know. I mean, because I learned Chinese using pinyin, not bopomorpho.
The thing about living in Taiwan as well, they use juyin, and I can't read juyin. I keep meaning to learn it, but then I'm too lazy, you know.
Because Taiwan is the only place that uses that, really.
Yes.
So pinyin is kind of pretty much worldwide for doing Chinese things.
Yeah, I mean, I think with the way a lot of characters got simplified, it actually removed a lot of the actual original meaning of the character. And I think something got lost. They lost something with it. So, I mean, just give you an example, right? So the character like T, Shantida T, for body, in traditional characters, the radical for that is go, which means bones. But in simplified, it's the character is ren, which means person.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, well, it's not really, because like your bones are like the structure of your body.
Right.
There's also things like ting, so to hear something. And traditional, the radical for that is r, like your ear, or
Right.
do. And then simplified, it's ko, which means your mouth.
Yeah.
And it's like, but you don't listen with your mouth, you listen with your ears.
Yeah, yeah.
So there's loads of examples like that, many examples like that. And so you sort of realize that, and it also kind of feels like when you read traditional characters, like you feel like you're connecting with the language more than with simplified, because you're kind of understanding, you're sort of seeing like the evolution and how and what the character represents more than simplified. Simplified feels like you're kind of more disconnected from the actual culture behind it.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. So, well, your interest in Mandarin, did it start when you were back in the UK, or partly because you went to China? I mean, what was your interest for that?
So I've been interested in it for a long time, and because I used to study karate when I was in the UK, I actually wanted to study Japanese.
That's Japanese, though.
Yeah, I wanted to study Japanese originally. And but I never really got the motivation for it. And then I was at university, and a friend of mine, he told me one day, he said, "Oh, I feel like studying Japanese." And then I just thought, "Oh yeah, great, that's a great idea," because I've been thinking about doing it for several years prior to that. And he got really upset with me and said, "No, I don't want you studying Japanese because you're copying me." So I thought, okay, I'll study Chinese then. And that was kind of how I started. But then I found it really hard to study Chinese because the book I had wasn't very good. Like it, and I sort of later realized why. So I sort of failed to kind of learn Chinese. And then I saw a documentary about the Mathematics Olympiad, the UK Mathematics Olympiad team. And they had a guy on it.
Mathematics team?
Yeah.
Really?
There's something called the Maths Olympiad for secondary school students, like 16 to 18-year-olds. They do these competitions where they have these really, really hard problems, and you have to solve them, and then you get points, and then you win medals based on how many points you get and stuff.
Oh, interesting.
And anyway, there was a guy in the documentary who was very similar to me. He had autism. He could speak Chinese. He was interested. He had a Chinese girlfriend that he married. And he said he learned Chinese by learning to read and write. And I thought, okay, that's where I'm going wrong. So I went to China. It was either a few months after that or 6 months after that. I went to China, and this was in 2008, just before the Olympics, the Beijing Olympics. And at the time, and I went with my ex-wife, my first ex-wife, who was Chinese, and we went to visit her family, and they couldn't speak any English, and at the time I couldn't speak any Chinese. And I remembered the documentary, and I thought, you know what, I should really start learning some Chinese. So when we went back to Beijing, I went to a bookstore, and I found a book that teaches you how to read and write Chinese characters, and it teaches you the 400 most common Chinese characters, which actually accounts for about 80% of all Chinese characters. And I just got so interested in it that I sort of kept going. So I finished that book in like a month. And then I went to, and that inspired me to go to Shanghai, where I then studied Chinese. And that's how I got fluent in Chinese.
Oh, wow. Wow, you're way more fluent in Chinese than I. I have to look into that book. When you speak Chinese, though, or Mandarin, do you feel different than, as in yourself, as when you're speaking English?
Kind of, yeah. I feel like in English, I can express myself a little bit better than in Chinese, which is kind of understandable because it's my first language. And sometimes in Chinese, I struggle a little bit to maybe express exactly what I mean. So I have to sort of think about it a little bit more if I want to say certain things. But in general, if I'm speaking or listening to Chinese, I'm just saying what I would say in English anyway.
One of my friends asked me, when was it that you stopped translating in your head from English to Chinese? And I had to think about it, and I don't know when exactly it stopped, but are you doing that? Are you like still?
No,
Yeah.
I never did that actually.
Oh, wow.
I never. It's something that just came to me very naturally. So even right at the start, I was never actually translating things in my head. I would like when I started reading. So when I started reading Chinese, it was just it was very simple stuff, but it was just simple characters. 中国大, China is big. 日本小. I would always just know what it meant naturally. So it's not something I ever did when I was learning languages. I just it's just like listening to English. I understand it or I don't understand it.
Right. Okay. Wow. That's, do you speak other languages besides English and Chinese?
No,
Okay.
I never really. I wanted to learn I still wanted to learn Japanese, but and the amount of effort it took to learn Chinese, I just sort of can't face it starting from scratch again.
The reason I was asking you earlier about if you felt different, because sometimes people, for some reason, when they're speaking a different language other than their mother tongue, they feel like they can be somebody else.
I sound different. I think I speak with a slightly different accent, but I'm not. I'm just still being myself. If you know what I mean.
Yeah.
I'm just saying what I would have said if I was speaking English.
Okay.
I'm not or acting the way I would act. I'm not someone else. I'm just myself. I'm just using a different form of communication.
You were 12 when you were diagnosed with autism.
I was, yeah.
But before that, had you thought that you were different or before
No, my parents noticed it originally. Because I would come home from school, I'd be very upset all the time, and I used to have a lot of what they call meltdowns, where you kind of start screaming and crying and go into like a very sort of deep kind of, I wouldn't call it a rage, but just this kind of very deep kind of place where you just want to get out, and you're just like, the whole world, you just explode. And this was happening quite regularly, so they took me to see a child's psychiatrist. The psychiatrist gave them a checklist of symptoms, and my parents would tick off the ones that I was displaying. So it was 1 tick for a little bit, 2 for a lot, 3 for very much, and they showed me this because they never told me about the diagnosis until about 2 years after that.
Oh.
They kept it quiet, but they showed me that years later, and based on that, the psychiatrist diagnosed me. So at the time, it wasn't called autism. There was 2 separate things. It was called Asperger's and autism, and this was back in 1997. They've decided that actually Asperger's and autism are the same thing. They're just different spectrums. It's just the different levels of severity. So because I was previously diagnosed with Asperger, that just got transferred to a diagnosis of, or relabeled, or I should say, as autism. So that's why I tell people I've got autism, because there is no such thing as Asperger syndrome anymore.
Okay, yeah.
It doesn't exist.
I didn't know that until you told me that.
Yeah, now I think these days there's 3 levels of, and I forget what they're called. I think it's like mild, medium, and severe, or something like that. And I'm in the mild category.
Okay.
Which means very high function. Well, as you can tell, very high functioning, very articulate, sort of generally able to take care of myself and function as a kind of adult, if you like, sort of normal, if you want to call it that. But obviously, I've still got limitations and things that disable me in daily life, like communication being the biggest one.
Did you ever ask your parents, though, why they waited 2 years before they told you? I mean, were you getting any help at that time?
Not really. At the time, there wasn't really like the same level of support that there is now. And I was getting bullied at school, like sort of seeing a pattern here, and they felt at the time, because I was dealing with a lot of bullying at school and a lot of issues, they didn't want to overburden me with something extra, if you like. So that's why they sort of kept it quiet for a couple of years. And then one day my dad just told me, because I used to go out taking photographs with my dad. We'd go out for walks in nature and various places nearby, because where my parents live in Scotland is very kind of rural, very sort of countryside. So my dad and I used to go out in the mornings at weekends, get up early when the sun is nice, because I don't know if you know about photography, but the best lighting for photography is in the morning or in the evening, because the sun is low in the sky and you get much kind of warmer colors. And he just told me in the car one day, he just said, "Oh, Fraser, by the way, you just sprung it on me and said you've got something called Asperger's." And it's like, what's that? You know, that was like my reaction. I was like, what's that? Because I had no idea. Like, I remember going and seeing doctors and things, but I didn't know, like, because of my autism, I wasn't really aware of what was going on. I was just getting taken to see a doctor, and then that was that. And you know, I have a very sort of low level of kind of awareness of stuff like that.
Can you explain autism to somebody that doesn't know about it, but through your lived experience? You know,
yeah.
How would you describe autism?
There's a very wide variation from individuals,
right,
in how it presents itself. But it's kind of, my kind of experience is, it's kind of like it feels almost sometimes like people are speaking a different language, like you're breaking social rules that you didn't even know existed. So people are so you're talking to someone and they're getting angry or offended by you, and you're not even aware that they're feeling that way, and then all of a sudden they'll just spring it on you and say, and get angry with you, and you've no idea why or what you supposedly did that made them so upset in the first place. And then you'll get told something like, "Oh yeah, you know, like you looked at this person the wrong way, or you did this, that, and the other." And like I remember one job I had in Taiwan. I've been fired twice in Taiwan, and I had to leave a few other jobs for different reasons. And one of them, they actually woman said to me directly to my face. She said, "How can you be a teacher if you've got autism?" I went, "What?" But there was one job in particular where one of the managers sat me down and started saying, "Oh, you've been looking at this person this way, and you've been making people uncomfortable by the way you've been looking at them." And I was like, "Well, I can't help how I'm looking at people." You know, like you just look at people. Like, what? You want me to control how I'm looking at people?
Yeah, I guess like nowadays, and more so because of all the situations that are happening, that certain social norms or certain behaviors, you know, once it's crossed a little bit, and I don't know if it's more in Asian countries compared to Western countries, you think, where those boundaries are crossed. What do you think?
I would say in Asia it's worse. Like, I used to sort of have this idea that in the UK, because I'm British, and there's kind of less allowance given towards me because I'm British, so I should know the kind of British sort of social norms, British social cultures.
Right.
And in Asia, I used to think that people gave me a little bit more leeway because they'd say, "Oh well, he's a foreigner." But I've kind of lately I've sort of realized that people are because there's less protection and less societal stigma around it. People are much more comfortable in expressing their prejudices and even acting on their prejudices. I'll give you an example. Like that's actually happened last night. As I say, I used to study karate, and I got banned from my old dojo under the JKA, primarily because of my autism, and I'll go into that story later. But I thought I'd try a different dojo. It's called the IJKA, which is a different organization, and I went to speak to the guy, and literally within about a minute or so of talking to the guy, he suddenly said to me, "Actually, I don't think you should train here. I think you should go and train somewhere else." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I'm talking to you and you're just sitting here looking around like this, doing this." And I said, "But I've got autism." And then he said, "And how old are you?" And I said, "I'm 41. And he said, "Oh, you're 41. He said, "And you still have autism?" And at that point, I basically just got up and walked out. And you know, it's like the guy was clearly, like, in his mind, I was breaking these social norms. Like, he said, "Oh, you didn't call in advance, you just dropped in." And I was like, but isn't that kind of how it works? Like it says online when the class times are. So if I want if I want to go into class, I'll just walk in, come to class. That's how it works, isn't it? So no, you should have called in advance, and you're not making eye contact with me, and so I don't have a good feeling about you. I feel uncomfortable with you and stuff like that. And it's like, so the guy had obviously had these very, very deep, or had these very strict social expectations, and and was extremely sensitive to them, and because I broke them, he was like, no, just get out.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really have to do a lot with cultural differences too, because the one thing that popped in my head when you were mentioning about the eye contact thing, because a lot of times in the West, when you're talking to people, you're looking at them eye to eye, and people feel like, oh, if you're not looking at them, then you're not honest, or you're not, trustworthy. Whereas in Asia, quite often, people look down when they talk to people. They don't necessarily have that eye-to-eye contact. So I think for yours, it was, I guess, must have been a compilation or a whole thing of different body language or body behaviors.
The guy I would describe him as very stereotypically kind of older generation Taiwanese.
Okay, so they're not so aware.
Yeah, because like younger Taiwanese people are way more tolerant of that sort of thing compared to, they're way more polite about it. And that's another thing is in Taiwan I found that a lot of older people, obviously not everybody obviously, but there seems to be quite a few older people that they act very entitled. Like one thing they'll do is, if they want to get past you, instead of saying excuse me, they literally just shove you out of the way, like physically just shove you out of the way, instead of just saying. And it's like, can you not just say excuse me and I'll move? You don't have to actually touch me. So the guy, it felt like he was entitled to judge me very quickly as a person without even giving me time to actually get to know me.
Yeah, and I think too it comes along with generational differences because we talk about cultural differences. Generations have that, and also if he's like the head of the dojo, which means that he's the shifu, so he probably expects things when he wants to, or whatever it is that he thinks. I don't know. It's a whole bunch of things.
Yeah, it's but the thing is, in karate, right? At least when I studied karate, there was something called the Dojo Kun, which is meant to be not just rules about how you conduct yourself in the dojo, but just general guidance about how to live life in general. So seek the perfection of character, honor defend the path of truth, honor the principles of etiquette, foster the spirit of effort, and guard against impetuous courage. And so like, he, in my opinion, he failed on point number one, by his reaction. Like he was just totally like impolite. Like if you get someone new coming into the dojo who says, I'd like to study here, you'd be more open and welcoming and say, yeah, sure, come on in. And he said he was eating, and because I went along quite early because I like to go early and sort of get ready and set up and stuff. And he was eating, and he said is that I interrupted his mealtime or something. And I was like, well, why didn't you just tell me to come back later? And, and we can have and you can join in with the next lesson. Something like that would have been like the polite thing to do. But instead he basically told me to get lost right away, and go train somewhere else. And it's like, that's just not karate,
Do you feel that he would have done the same thing if it was an Asian person and not a foreigner like you?
I don't know. It's hard to say. Impossible to say.
Yeah. I don't. Mealtimes are sacred to a lot of people.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like, this isn't the first time I had issues with a Taiwanese instructor, because in November I was joined part of the JKA, which is the Japanese Karate Association, which is the largest karate organization in the world. And I've never trained with the JKA directly. When I did karate in the UK, I was with an organization called the UKTKF, which stands for United Kingdom Traditional Karate Federation. And that was headed by a guy called Kawazoe, who broke away from the JKA. And so I was with them, and then when I went to university, I had to change to the KUGB, which is the Karate Union of Great Britain, which was founded by another famous karate guy called Inoue. I stopped karate for about 12 years because I went to China and was with the IPO for a long time and stuff, so I didn't study karate for many years. And then before I came to Taiwan, I went back and started studying in my old dojo, but they had recently rejoined the JKA, but it wasn't the JK per se, it was like the JKWF, which is kind of like a separate branch of the JK, if that makes sense. So I'd never actually trained with the JK proper until I came to Taiwan. And one of the things is that the JK has is they have competitions, right? Which was started by a guy called Nakayama, quite controversially. Because the guy who founded the JK, his instructor, a guy called Funakoshi, who's one of the most famous Japanese karate instructors in history, he didn't want competitions. He said karate is not competition, it's a journey of yourself. And he wanted it to be focused on self-defense, actual fighting. What would you do if you actually had to get in a fight with someone, for real, in the street? Not competition stuff, but Nakayama felt that competitions would promote karate. Anyway, they have competitions, but it's strictly optional. And I don't like competitions, so I typically opt out and say I'm not doing it because I just like to go to lessons and train and that's it. And so my instructor, he had a rule that said you had to enter at least one competition a year and blah, blah, blah. And I'd been sort of putting it off, and then we got to this competition that they were having at this JK competition, and he wanted me to enter that. I like sparring, it's called community, and it's, sparring for practice is fine. But when it's like an actual feels like an actual fight, and you're having to go up and get judged by people, and I just don't like it. So at the last minute, I just told him, actually, I just don't want to do it. I just feel really uncomfortable with it. I'm really nervous about it. And he lost his temper. Like he really got very, very angry with me, started raising his voice, was clearly very upset. He started saying things to me along the lines of, if you don't do the competitions, then you won't be able to grade for second Dan, you won't be able to become an instructor, this sort of thing. I told him I had autism months before that. And he, at the time, he said, well, that's fine, just let us know how we can help you with it and stuff like that. And I said to him, I've got autism and I don't, and he said, well, so what? And I said, well, the competitions make me very nervous, they make me very uncomfortable. And he's like, well, why should I let you be comfortable all the time? I said, well, because I'm a student and you've got a responsibility for my safety and well-being, and that sort of thing. And he just didn't want to hear it. So after that incident, I quit. I was like, I'm not coming back here again. I felt that his behavior had crossed the line, so I went and reported it to the police. Because in Taiwan, it's called public intimidation and coercion and unlawful detainment. But the first two are the biggest ones, public intimidation and coercion. So I went to the police and they agreed, based on my account, that there was potentially, he had potentially done something illegal, but obviously they have to investigate, there has to be evidence, before. So they're not obviously judging it, they're just saying, based on my account, there was something for them to investigate. So I went back to Scotland after that for 2 weeks to visit my family. And when I came back, another Scottish guy who's high-level karate practitioner who also lives in Taiwan, he started trying to pressure me to drop the case. He met with me twice and he told me, he kept saying things like that if Ken gets convicted, the guy's name was Ken, if he gets convicted, then that's my fault. To get convicted, first of all, the police have to investigate it, then it has to go to a prosecutor, then it has to go to court, and all of them would have to agree that the evidence showed he'd actually done something criminal, which obviously, and none of that is my fault, and obviously none of that had happened yet. That's like a lot of steps, to get, to actually get a conviction. But it still felt it was my duty to report that, because if you think someone has committed a crime, then you should report it. The second time he met me, he said that if I dropped the case, I could go back and train, and Ken would apologize to me, and we would forget it, and we'd move on. And so then I did go and drop the case. And then I went back to Ken and said, okay, I've dropped the police case. I want to come back to training. And he said, actually, you're banned. Basically, in a nutshell, he just said, actually, you're banned. You can't come back because you raised it, because you went to the police. And the reason cited is because you went to the police. And I was thinking, the Scottish guy, you knew I was banned, but you still advised me to drop it.
So actually, this kind of stuff, though, how does it make you feel?
Well, very, very angry. I mean, the thing about autism is that you have a very strong sense of justice, and if you feel that things have been unjust, it's very, very difficult to cope with. Like it happened at the IPO with the warning. I felt that was deeply unfair. And it's happened here again. And here it's even worse because I didn't actually do anything. Like the one that was angry and lost his temper was Ken. I was trying to de-escalate. I kept telling him, please calm down. We'll discuss it later when you're calm, etc., etc. And he wouldn't do it, I was trying to, and when he said to me, if you don't enter the competition, you can't grade for second Dan. I said, okay, that's fine. Then I won't grade for second Dan. No problem. I'll just be a first Dan. I just won't do competitions then. Like if that's the rule, then okay. And
do you feel like autism makes you see or allows you to see things only in black and white and not necessarily the gray areas in between, which, in life, there's a lot of those gray areas, and would that have been part of that?
Yes, a lot of ways. Yeah, that's quite an autistic trait. Yeah, things are very binary. It is or it isn't. It's either right or it's wrong. That sort of thing. But I mean, also being a patent examiner, I sort of learned to kind of look more at the kind of legal nuances. So like my legal training. Obviously, I'm aware that him actually getting found guilty / convicted is still a pretty high bar, So I understood that that's very unlikely to happen. But because of my autism, I felt that it's actually I'm sort of almost duty bound to go and report what I would see as potentially a criminal offense, if you know what I mean.
Right. So I wonder is because you mentioned it had happened to you before, and then this thing, and maybe, was that the time where you just said, "Hey, this is not right. I'm going to just have to do something about it"? Was that the point?
Well, at the time, it was very shocking, and I felt. When he was doing it, I actually felt genuinely unsafe. Like I was actually worried he was going to do something. Because at one point I said, "Look, I'm just going to go away, and I'll come back when you've calmed down." And he went, "No, you stay here," like that. And my thought was, "Oh my God!" I was like, I didn't know what to do. I was like, "Do I leave or do I stay?" Because if I leave, he might do something. He might actually physically do something. And so I was kind of actually worried for my personal safety. But then when I went home, and I thought, after it was all over and I went home and I thought about it for a few days, I thought, no, I can't accept this. I need to report it to a higher authority. So I reported it to the JKA as well, and the police. And the JKA didn't like it that I went to the police about it. Which, in my opinion, is also very anti-karate, because karate is meant to instill things in you like honesty and respect, and things like that, and integrity. When I was raised doing karate, if you were outside of the dojo, and if you weren't proven guilty, convicted or something, but if you did something like that, like actually started yelling at people, threatening people, they'd just kick you out. They'd say, "No, don't come back," because that behavior is just not acceptable. So
it's like a double standard in your eyes.
Yeah, because I'll tell you a story, right? One of my early instructors, he was going to his instructor's dojo with another guy, a friend, and they were looking for a parking space. And he saw some woman looked like she was leaving, so he just drove into the space. And then they got out of the car, and the woman got out and said, "Oh, actually, I was about to park there. You know, I was just pulling out to reverse in. I was actually, you know, in the middle of trying to park there." And the guy, not my instructor, the guy he was with, he, you know, lost his temper, started yelling and saying this, that, and the other. I don't know what he said, but you know, he was very upset with her. While that's going on, the dojo instructor comes along and sees it happening, and he goes, "What's happening?" And the woman said, I just told this guy I was trying to park here, and then he started just being really rude to me, and he started, you know, yelling at me and saying all these horrible things to me." And the instructor turned around to the guy and just said, "Never come back to my club again." That was that. You know what I mean? So like that kind of behavior, and blaming the victim was also kind of very upsetting and very hard to take, because it was like it directly contradicted the very principles that I had been taught when I was 14 or 15 when I first started learning karate.
Yeah, so why has karate been such an important part of your life? Is it something, I mean, is it related to your autism, or is it just a personal preference?
I think I enjoy the discipline of it. And also it gives me a kind of grounded way to let out a lot of my frustrations and aggressions, you know. So I'll feel like because obviously we all have things that upset us in life, and you know, like the thing that happened yesterday, very upsetting with the other guy. And so when you're actually in the training hall, you can really let out a lot of those feelings in a controlled manner. You know what I mean? And it just, in the exercise, and just because one of the things you do in karate is something called a kiai, which is like a shout, like an expression of kind of, I guess, an expression of your energy. You feel that kind of, I won't call it anger, but you feel that kind of energy boil up inside you, and then you just let it all out.
Right.
And then you go home and you just feel a little more relaxed and like, okay, everything is just kind of, it just kind of helps you feel more controlled in your life. And the other thing is, it's when you're dealing with people, again, it's like, especially in Taiwan, there'll be things that happen that just frustrate you enormously. And it just helps to kind of remain calm and remain grounded and not let the frustration get to you, and still be polite to people. You know, it's because, you know, like I've lost my temper in Taiwan before, you know, many times, but when I do karate, it doesn't happen anywhere near as much, because it just helps me to kind of stay in control of my emotions and stay in control of myself, so I don't, because losing your temper in the moment, it might feel good in the moment, but afterwards you always regret it. Staying calm, and that actually makes you feel better afterwards, because you feel like, you know, that you actually were in control of that situation, and, you know, and you handled it effectively.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of ways then that people use to release pent-up energy or stress and things like that, and karate partly was for you. Do you feel that because that you have this autism, that you've had to change who you are, or kind of hide yourself or adapt yourself to different circumstances?
No, because I'm not really capable of doing that. Because that's the thing, like, so it's what you're describing is called masking.
Yeah.
And women with autism, or females with autism, they're very good at that. And autism presents itself in women differently than it does in men. So women with autism tend to have less social issues than men. But I've never been able to do that. And I actually had one of my former bosses said to me during one time in a meeting, he said, "Why don't you try masking more?" And I was like, wow. You know, it's
interesting.
It's like saying, so why don't you just try being a bit taller? You know?
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, you are what you are and what people see. Now, having autism that you have, I know it's a mild form of autism. Do you feel, because you mentioned that you teach, or you taught English, and do you feel that makes you a better teacher, or helps you being a teacher, or, I mean, towards your students in any ways? Or
so there's a few ways. One is that I'm actually very, very good at communicating information to people in ways that they understand it. And like that's one of my strengths. The other thing is because of all the kind of negative experiences I've had, my sort of feeling is not to do that to other people. So I tend to treat students a lot more fairly than someone else who might not have had the same experiences that I've had.
Right. Okay.
You know.
That's interesting. So it helps in the teaching for English anyway for
Yeah.
kids and things. Yeah, because that's funny because you also mentioned that you have communication problems as having autism, but now you just said that you actually are quite a good communicator. So what's the difference in terms of what parts are not good?
Well, communicating information is sort of slightly different when you're trying to explain facts to people, or explain concepts to people, versus communication in a social setting, like you know, like trying to actually get along with someone, and you know, it's like a different
Different nuances, yes, different skills, yeah.
Different skills. And so if people are just sitting down in a lecture or in a classroom environment, you're not communicating in the same way. I'm trying to impart facts and knowledge. Whereas if you're having a conversation with someone like we are now, that's a different situation. So with that, it's important to be able to do things like read body language, read cues, understand how someone's feeling, or if what you're saying might be upsetting to people, that sort of thing. And I am terrible at that.
Okay. Well, you're doing pretty good.
Thank you.
If you were able to tell somebody, just anybody, or give them advice in terms of how to communicate or interact with somebody that has autism, what are some things that you would say?
I think I think there's three things that I wish people would show more of, and it's something I see very little of in my daily life, and that's patience, tolerance, and understanding. That would be it, you know. Because if people had more of those three things, I think it would make my life, at least, and probably a lot of people's lives, a lot easier.
Well, that would apply to everybody, not just somebody with autism, right?
Well, that's the thing. Like, as when you sort of say, let's help someone with autism, let's do X, Y, and Z to help people with autism, and you find that actually doing those things, a lot of the things that you would do actually would help everybody.
Yeah.
I can think of an example at the top of my head. So I think when my mum was a secondary school teacher, and she said I think they had like this idea to help autistic people by having color-coded areas inside the school for different subjects or different places that you needed to go. And my mum thought of it and said, actually, that would be good for everybody. I mean, like the other one was when I did job interviews, I would ask, one of the adjustments I would ask is to avoid certain questions like, why do you want to work here? Or tell me about yourself. You know, these kind of very vague, open-ended questions.
Oh.
And just to ask kind of the more sort of, try to ask more closed questions, you know, with clear answers. When I sort of give ideas how to help autistic people, it's generally stuff that is actually applicable to everybody, not just autistic people. At least in my experience.
Yeah, general courtesy, general etiquette, general behaviors.
Or just patience in general, because you know, if you meet someone that's communicating differently or breaking what you would see as social norms, then you know, having the patience to maybe understand that maybe this person isn't doing it on purpose is, you know, and just being a bit tolerant of their differences just goes a long way to helping people.
I totally agree that, you know, be tolerant of other people, because cultural differences, you know, gender differences, a lot of those things are happening in everyday life. So then with all the experiences that you have, then I wanted to come to this portion of the interview, which is your wow. So wow meaning words of wisdom.
Oh, okay.
So do you have any that you have to share with the audience in terms of what you've learned?
Oh yeah, I forgot to I think my favorite actually, okay, so my favorite thing is a Chinese saying, which apparently is not very common here in Taiwan, but it's something I learned from China when I was studying Chinese. And in Chinese, it's 小一小，十年少，丑一丑，白了头. And what that means is, if you smile, then you will be 10 years younger. But if you worry, you will get gray hair. Mm-hmm. So
Okay.
those are my words of wisdom.
All right, that's interesting. Okay. Let me see. Do you have anything else that you wanted to add before we leave?
Can I plug my website?
Sure.
So my company is called Stewart IP. My website is stewartip.com.tw. So if you need IP-related advice or help with patents, then come and get in touch.
Okay, and I'll actually put it in the description also on the webcast.
Thank you.
Sure. Thanks again for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us on this episode of OAL, Old Asian Lady. And if you liked our podcast, please help out by liking, subscribing, and sharing. All right. Thank you. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.